2, 3 seconds, and depart.
Although risky, Ecker's high-speed mission is a success, and the photographs he took left no doubt what was there.
We see the missile-ready tin, we see 5 missiles, we see fueling and checkout vehicles, and even if you look close, you can see men walking around. Now, this photograph is taken at 250 feet, about the speed of sound. And this is the kind of thing, now when we're showing this to policymakers, this is what they really understand.
With Soviet denial still fresh, UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson arrives in New York for a Security Council session, armed with a surprise. Leading the meeting is Soviet Ambassador Zorin. Stevenson interrupts.
Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sights in Cuba? Yes or no?
You will have your answer in due course.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision.
Stevenson doesn't wait. Instead, he launches into a presentation that would stun the world, and especially William Ecker.
He reached behind him, there was an easel there, and he flipped the shroud on it off, and there were the pictures, right at the UN.
At the cost of revealing secret surveillance capabilities, Ecker's photographs make the U.S. case undeniable. With American ships in place, the quarantine goes into effect. 2 Soviet ships, the Yuri Gagarin and the Kimovsk, steam toward the blockade line. Between them, one of the Soviet submarines carrying a nuclear torpedo. In the White House, Defense Secretary McNamara narrates the situation to the president.
There is a submarine very close, we believe, to each of them. The submarine will be at the barrier tonight, late today, and hence it's a very dangerous situation. The Navy recognizes this, is fully prepared to meet it.
The war might have started this way. The American ships attacked the Soviet submarine and somehow harm it. In that case, the commander would definitely have to use his weapons.
President Kennedy is reluctant to start the war here.
Get the surface or if you take some action, to assist the merchant ship, but we're just going to attack it anyway. At what point are we going to attack it? I think we ought to wait on that today. We don't want to have the first thing we attack is the Soviet submarine.
It was almost a fatal tragedy for us. During this cat-and-mouse play with the Americans, we almost completely spent our battery. My engineer said to me, "Our battery is almost dead. We can't remain underwater. We can either surface or sink." I decided to surface. It was daylight. When I came up, I saw strange ships, American ships.
Robert Kennedy would later say that this moment is the one that brought the world closest to nuclear war. And it is now that the U.S. Strategic Air Command moves to defense condition, or DEFCON 2. Nearly 60 Strategic Air Command aircraft loaded with nuclear weapons are airborne around the clock. Bombers on the ground are loaded with nuclear weapons, given targets, and placed on a 15-minute alert.
I thought, if there was a war, an invasion of Cuba, there would be nuclear war. And that would result in the disappearance of millions and millions of people.
On October 26th, word comes to the White House that inbound Soviet ships have stopped.
Now, what did they say they're doing with those, John? Well, they either stop them or reverse direction.
I suddenly received a message from headquarters ordering me to leave my position and retreat about 100 miles and take a stationary position.
The Soviets, it seems, have blinked. For now, at least, the first shots of war will not take place at sea. But on land and in the air, the threat of nuclear war is greater than it has ever been. During the 25th and 26th of October, the Strategic Air Command remains at DEFCON 2. In the event of war, the Strategic Air Command has but one nuclear scenario: total nuclear commitment, known as the Single Integrated Operational Plan, or SIOP. It envisions sending every American nuclear missile, aircraft, and submarine to launch against not only the Soviet Union, but the entire communist world. While launch authority rests only with Premier Khrushchev and President Kennedy, many types of nuclear weapons on both sides can be released without that authority. The detonation of a single nuclear weapon could quickly escalate into global nuclear devastation.
So it was extremely dangerous situation. We were at a stage when that could have happened without the direct will of Khrushchev and Kennedy. It could happen as a result of nervous breakdown of a rank-and-file people.
The blockade may have stopped the incoming Soviet ships, but 134 nuclear warheads have already landed. All 3 of the SS-4 missile regiments are now operational. Engineers like Mikhail Bernov receive orders from Moscow to increase launch readiness to just 2.5 hours. The nuclear warheads for the missiles are brought closer to the launch sites.
Our storage area for nuclear warheads was 50-60 kilometers away from us, so the actual combat readiness could be achieved in no less time than 5.5 hours in all. The readiness was 2 hours and 30 minutes once everything was in place there.
But the Soviets still do not act to prevent U.S. overflights. Cuban forces, however, are becoming more agitated by the continuous violation of Cuban airspace.
If you have an anti-aircraft battery in place, the idea is to use them. But really, there was no decision on the part of the Soviets to start shooting against the U-2. Remember that the Soviets were the ones who were manning the SAM-2, the anti-aircraft missiles.
In defiance of Soviet complacency, Cuban anti-aircraft guns fire on U.S. reconnaissance planes. With the crisis escalating, new hope of a diplomatic solution comes from an unlikely source. ABC reporter John Scully meets with a Soviet diplomat known as Alexander Fomin at the Occidental Restaurant in Washington, D.C., a block from the White House. His real name is Alexander Feklissov.
My position as a counselor was that of a cover, because I was an intelligence officer, and moreover, I was the resident of the Russian intelligence group in Washington at that time.
Scully had talked with State Department officials and had been briefed on how to handle the conversation.
Coffee was served, and without any overtures, he said, "On the authority of the highest American authority, I am proposing these terms of the Cuban crisis solution. First, the Soviet Union takes its missiles from Cuba and the U.S. removes its blockade. Second, the President gives a public pledge of non-aggression against Cuba." I said, "There's a question, what do you mean by highest authority of the United States?" And he said it letter by letter.
John Fitzgerald Kennedy, President of the United States.
In Moscow, Khrushchev composes a personal and emotional letter to Kennedy, appealing for an end to the crisis. He offers to remove the missiles in return for Kennedy's promise to end the quarantine and not invade Cuba. When the letter is finally received, decoded, and translated, it is after 9 p.m. on the 26th. 12 hours later at 9 a.m. on the 27th, ExComm reconvenes in the White House. While members are discussing the conciliatory Khrushchev letter, President Kennedy is handed a news bulletin and reads it aloud.
Premier Khrushchev told President Kennedy yesterday to withdraw offensive weapons from Cuba if the United States withdrew its rockets from Turkey. He did. Well, it's read by both the associations and put it out so far. Reuters said the same thing. He did? He didn't really say that, did he? I may not be putting out another leather paper.
XCOM thinks that Khrushchev, or some new hardline element in Moscow, is adding further demands. The removal of U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey.
You know, to get those two different messages in close proximity, the question that was raised in the minds of not only myself, but a lot of other people, who's in charge in the Soviet Union? You know, and that's when things really get dangerous. You know, if there is some uncertainty about who's in command and who's giving the orders on the other side, that's when you know you're really in danger.
The danger is becoming very real, and for one man, it will be fatal. Ever since the Soviet missiles were first discovered, the U.S. Air Force has been flying periodic spy missions over Cuba. So far, the Soviets have hesitated to fire. 9 a.m. Major Rudolph Anderson takes off from McCoy Air Force Base in Orlando, Florida, for his overflight of Cuba. At 10 a.m. local time, he guides his U-2 over the Cuban port of Baines. Against standing orders from Moscow, the Soviet commander on the ground decides to fire. The missile streaks 75,000 feet into the sky and bursts next to Anderson's aircraft, killing him and sending the U-2 spinning down to Earth. The Cuban Missile Crisis now has its first combat fatality. Word of the shoot-down doesn't reach the president until a 4 p.m. meeting with XCOM.
U-2 was shot down. Low altitude, so it was shot down. Yeah, Roger said it was not shot down. Pilot killed? Well, this is much an escalation by them, isn't it?
A U.S. pilot has been killed, and the military want a response. Airstrikes preceding the invasion of Cuba are set to start tomorrow, unless Kennedy and Khrushchev can find a way out. In Washington, the president decides to send Bobby Kennedy to meet with Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin and make an offer. The Soviets would dismantle and immediately remove their missiles from Cuba. The U.S. would end the quarantine and promise not to invade Cuba. But the Kennedys secretly offer one more, very substantial incentive. The U.S. would also remove NATO Jupiter missiles from Turkey. But only if that concession were kept utterly secret by the Soviets. Kennedy gives the Soviets 24 hours to respond. With U.S. attacks on Cuba just hours away, the nuclear battlefield is as close as it has ever been. For those in the know, both in Washington and Moscow, fear has reached a fever pitch.
I told my wife, I will not go to work today. I don't know what will be tomorrow. It's quite possible that tomorrow we will not be alive. Let's go to the cinema to see a new film.
The Secret Service wanted to take the president to the underground. Well, I had been to the underground and I was cleared for it. That night was one of the most miserable that I've ever spent because I kept thinking of what could happen and, you know, that I would be in a safe place and my family would be incinerated because I was convinced that Washington would be a target.
The whole of mankind was on the brink, on the verge of a nuclear abyss. We were 2 hours away from the end. 2 hours.
October 28th, 3 a.m. Moscow. The Soviets have an announcement to make, a personal message from Khrushchev to President Kennedy. This time, they use Radio Moscow rather than a Western Union telegram. Khrushchev announces that the missile sites will be dismantled and returned to the Soviet Union. Is the crisis finally over? President Kennedy puts off military action for one day while he waits for that day's reconnaissance photography to be examined.
The planes are out, and when we look at the photography, now they're pulling back. You could see that they'd pulled the missiles back, they had pulled the launchers out. It was obvious now that they had gotten the word.
Over the following months, 60 ballistic missiles and 134 nuclear warheads are dismantled and shipped back to the Soviet Union. Although serious tensions remain, one of the most perilous chapters of the 20th century is over.
The United States has not been at DEFCON 2 since the Cuban Missile Crisis. After spending a few weeks at the brink of nuclear war, both the Americans and the Soviets took steps to make certain that superpower confrontation was never conducted in the dark, and that the other side always had a way out. Thank heaven for second chances. The Cuban Missile Crisis almost left us without one. I'm Tom Clancy. Thanks for watching.